Thank you very much, distinguished delegates, and I'd like to thank Ashley Alder and all his team for this very interesting conference. I must say I go to many conferences, but I found this to be a really high-quality day. Let's remember what we were meant to be talking about, the new perspectives on the future of regulation in the aftermath of the financial crisis. I think we got to the regulatory frontiers. Not always, but I think by and large we were testing out the new ideas, discussing them. Quite wide agreement on a number of things, and I want to come on to that. I was very interested because, of course, living in the West, to see the focus here in Hong Kong. And if you look at the 5 panels, 3 of the 5 have dealt with conduct, corporate governance, culture, integrity, audit. Just heard all these issues versed again. Maybe that's an indicator of major issues here in Hong Kong. I can't judge that. But it's interesting that 3 of the 5 panels were really focused on those issues, which I think is very good, by the way. I said earlier today that I think these issues are the missing 5th column of global financial repair. One of them, of course, the one I was on international assessment of global regulation, and one was focused on investment product design and production of investment products. Again, I think that's a big interest in this country and this part of the world. My second remark, and I'm going to give impressions here. I'm not going to go into each panel, and so excuse me for that. But I think it's more interesting, perhaps, for you at the end of a long day. I think the debate, if we were having a similar conference, let us say in London or New York, I think the subjects would be quite different. There'd be an awful lot of focus on shadow banking and the OTC derivatives issues, certainly over regulation, but perhaps less strongly than one has heard today. And of course, the agenda 5 years ago would have been totally different, wouldn't it? It would all have been about systemic stability. I mean, have we got a stable financial system or not? And today, really, we were talking quite a lot of technicalities. We were talking the importance of assessment, certainly behavior, culture, ethics, looking forward, but we're not talking anymore about systemic survival. And my goodness me, those were dangerous days, as you will all remember, and I remember very vividly when we didn't know what was going to happen from one day to the next. So we're in a slightly better situation, aren't we, here? Economic growth is returning in the OECD countries. Chinese growth seems to be solid. The IMF forecasts for the first time have pointed upwards from their previous forecast. So I think there's a feeling of improving things going forward. Let me reflect a little bit on the global picture, and maybe I'm biased because that's where I come from. I think our panel got to the view that there's been a lot of progress. The system is safer, as Ranjit Singh said, but not entirely prudentially safe yet. No doubt there has been significant progress on capital. We've got 10 times more capital in the banking system, apparently. Certainly philosophical, intellectual agreement on what has to be done in derivatives, although we have these big conflicts of law, this extraterritoriality dimension. That was one of the first things Ashley talked about. And that's a major concern, very evidently, in this part of the world. I should say, by the way, on OTC derivatives that somebody here, Alex Alam, has played an outstanding role in helping one part of that file move forward on margin requirements for OTC derivatives. And my goodness me, that was difficult. We've made some progress on shadow banking. I wonder how much. I don't think we fully understood the problem. But things are cranking forward. But again, I think there's some way to go. On resolution, this to me is the key issue. Let me quote what Martin Wolf, one of the great, I think, economic journalists, wrote in the Financial Times this week. And the article was not about this particular issue, it was about his balance sheet of Chairman Bernanke. But he said this: the second big issue of the Bernanke legacy is whether enough has been done to make the financial system less fragile. I remain, he said, I remain concerned. Yes, regulation and oversight have improved, but in essence, today's financial system is the same as before. Worse, he says, it is dominated by a small number of thinly capitalized, complex, global behemoths. And he goes on, the notion that such institutions could be resolved in a panic without triggering panic remains untested, and partly for this reason, government promises not to bail them out are not credible. This is a highly troubling legacy. These are the words of Martin Wolf. I don't think I would go as far as that, but I think I would certainly agree that this issue is at the core of that judgment about whether we will have succeeded or not at global level. And as I think I said, it's remarkable how mild the public has been all over the world at the 15% loss of GDP. Of course, that's affected different countries in different ways. But it may not be the same next time. I heard those words from one of the most prominent central bankers in the world who said, and we should remember these words, I think, who said, if it happens again, capitalism, he said, would be switched off. So that's why I take these things very, very seriously. And this issue of resolution is at the core, the absolute core, of whether we will succeed. We've got, as I said, important inflections now towards assessment, implementation. And we're doing this job with weak institutions. We have no binding power. So if a jurisdiction, doesn't matter who it is, says, I'm not going to participate in this assessment because I don't agree with the standard, there is nothing we can do. So do we have a pick-and-choose .com model? Or do we have, and do we want, real global convergence? I hope we want the latter. A long way to go on corporate governance. I'll come back to that. We have to build, in my view, stronger institutions. Our risk analysis needs to be improved. I don't think we can do enough of that. We've got to focus on where the dangerous points are. And one thing which I didn't mention this morning was that there is an industry outside this room, somewhere, whose sole purpose is to basically collapse the global financial system. And I'm talking about cybercrime. That's their full-time job, with different motivations. I think we better take this very seriously indeed. And we have to, and I think Ashley was absolutely right at the beginning when he said, do we fully understand how this all works? I came over here to Hong Kong on a magnificent new airplane, the 380 Airbus. Some of you may have been on one. I reckon the pilot and the technicians understand every single widget of how that instrument works. We don't understand financial markets like that. We don't have the knowledge of an operator of a nuclear power station who has to know how the tubes connect if something goes wrong. We don't have that. It's quite extraordinary that we don't, frankly, in this modern day and age. Extraterritoriality, as I said, right at the beginning, quite present, I think, underlying theme throughout the day. We've got the two big sharks. And if I'm a little bit frank, Asia-Pacific today is a global regulatory taker, not a shaper. And the question that this region has to ask itself is that normal? Do we want to be stronger? What are our common interests? And surely, as probably in 20 or 30 years' time, as perhaps the biggest capital markets in the world, if you sum them up in this area, I wouldn't have thought that's a proposition you like. And I don't think you should sustain that. So I, again, would encourage, both through the chair of the Asia-Pacific region of IOSCO in the Financial Stability Board, increased efforts to build a common Asian view, if possible. You know, people say, as I said earlier, oh, everybody's so different in this part of the world. Well, do you think Germany and the UK and France are similar? In some respects they are. In many respects they are not. But once you sit down in the room, according to rules and procedures, it's surprising what you can agree, even when apparently everybody disagrees about everything. So I do think there's a real interest to start building on common interests, and they can be very practical and not necessarily institutional. If we look at the issues that are coming before us in the regulatory sense, non-bank, non-insurance SIFIs, all the benchmarks, derivatives, shadow banking, risk analysis, securitization, all the stuff on audit quality, long-term infrastructure, SME financing, crowdfunding, cybercrime. Can anybody deal with that on their own? I mean, can Hong Kong just deal with all that without reference to the global? No, I don't think anybody can. And I think actually, if you believe in global capital markets, you have to start really seriously investing and believing and strengthening the global regulatory framework. So we've got the pickandchoose.com model, or we've got the serious, intellectual, and responsible global convergence regulatory model. I urge you to support this. And as Greg Medcraft said, there are things we can do, very practical things like trying to time our legislative processes in the same way so we don't get this first mover advantage problem. Granularity, diminishing the degrees of freedom for the regulator. Early action to stop. It's no good trying to regulate at global level when half the world's already adopted or adopting standards. So I think there is a massive agenda here and a massive interest, if I may say so, for this part of the world to contribute in a really effective way. On the corporate governance discussions, I'm not going to go into details. As I said, I'm delighted that they were so present. I was very interested in what Jacob Hook has just said. Investors are punishing misconduct. Good. The more that the link between good corporate governance practice and economic penalty, financial penalty, shares being weak, the better. We saw that evidence from the equity market. I think this is just so essential. If you look at the correlation between those big firms that failed in this crisis and the type of people who are running them, I've read the books, you've read the books. I won't mention the names, I'm too polite. But some of the people who were running those firms just beggared belief. The way the boards did not function. The risk management that didn't exist, gung-ho, masochistic megalomaniacs, some of them. And they led their firms and society and minus 15% of GDP into serious, dangerous situation. And that is why I think it is so important, and I would strongly encourage this part of the world to be a thought leader, to be a real champion of top-class corporate governance. I just don't think you can lose from that. On the contrary, I think, and the evidence is growing, that you actually gain from it. I also think that one issue which did not come up, which was sanctions, and I happen to think that sanctions regimes in the world for serious offenses in the financial world are bordering on the laughable. There are exceptions. I can't understand why in one country in Europe the fines for LIBOR manipulation are about a third those applied in the United States. Was the damage a third less? No, it wasn't. So actually I think we have a global interest in strengthening sanctions regimes and making sure that those who want to abuse markets find no respite in another jurisdiction. I was joking the other day when I said that to somebody that actually the first person, new interns in a company should hear from should be the governor of the local jail. And I mean that seriously. I think young people have to understand they abuse markets, jail is where they're going to go. And so I do think corporate governance is crucial, but I think it has to be backed up by very strong sanctions regime. Two further points, and I will liberate you, I hope. Overregulation. Andrew Sheng and others talked about that. Quite possibly there's overregulation, and there may well be more. And if we see a continuance of the sort of scandals that we've seen, who knows what's going to come out of the Forex investigations or the commodity investigations? Are we going to see others after this? What do you think that does to the regulator? The pressures on the regulator to act become incessant politically. So the ball's in the industry's court. Behave or don't complain. That the regulatory bar is going to keep swinging in one direction. So I don't think it's surprising. Probably there is an overreaction, but it's not going to stop until behavior is assured. Finally, on investor protection, they're the familiar arguments about level playing fields, complex products, disclosure. I don't think disclosure it's certainly part of the argument. It's certainly part of the policy. It can't be the whole policy. All the evidence shows that consumers basically don't understand, or understand very little. It's not surprising they're not taught about it at school, not taught Latin and cooking and things like that, but not about how to manage your lives. It's a bit surprising. I would have thought, actually, the smartest countries in the world are going to make financial education mandatory from the youngest age onwards, which will build a much stronger demand side for financial products. Just one figure here. Martin Wheatley, in fact, often quotes that when you sign up for a bank account in London with a major bank, you have to read 29,000 words. 29,000 words. Of course, nobody does it. They just sign off. That's just one illustration why disclosure is not sufficient. Now, Greg Medcraft, the Australian position is, informed consumers, responsibility of end consumers. Others will shift towards more being very cautious. Traditionally, France has been in that camp. There's no right and wrong here. But I do think that it's incumbent on all of us to start thinking about these new ideas on behavior economics. It seems to me there's a lot in this to try and help consumers make the right decision. Not to take decisions for consumers, but to help consumers get to the right place, because that will, I think, over time, result in a more stable financial system. I do apologize for being a little radical. I hope that I've given you some personal thoughts of what I think has been an excellent day. And I'd like to thank again our hosts who have been and put on, I think, a remarkable conference. Thank you very much.